Hi everybody. So this video is just a plug for tomorrow's free speech demo in Dublin. So before I go off on a ramble about anything else, I just want to note the time, the place, the date. It's tomorrow. It's tomorrow at 2 p.m. So that's Saturday, 16th of November, 2 p.m. outside Dáil Éireann, Dublin city centre. So 2 p.m. If you're just hearing about it now, that gives you time to get a ticket or get on a bus or drive up or whatever in the morning with plenty of time to spare if you're free. So it'd be great to see people there. I'll be there myself. Now, with that said, I need to talk about free speech a little bit, right? Because I need to put some, flesh on the bones here. I suppose let's start on why I'm talking about this, why the demo is happening tomorrow, which is not organized by me, just to note, and I'm not speaking for the people who are organizing this. This is just my perspective. So the demo and this video are the one thing we do agree on for sure is that we are responding to the government's intention to introduce a hate speech law to bring us up to international norms on this level. Now, hate speech, of course, is a dog whistle or a euphemism for censorship, for state censorship, and I don't agree with that. I needn't belabor the point as to why I don't agree with that. But let's just, I'm going to read off a few choice quotes in terms of the discourse on free speech, the kind of boilerplate stuff, just to get that out of the way. And then I want to talk about, why it matters to me and what I think this is really about. But it's important to do some of the general free speech stuff first. So, I have a quote from an author here just outlining how free speech is essential to democracy. Now, in my words, I think it's common sense. If you don't have free speech, you don't really have democracy, because I might say XYZ is my platform. I'm going to go for election, and people may love it. I may sweep all the way into government, or I might fail miserably, get no votes. And that's the marketplace that democracy sets up, and that's pretty fair. Now, if what I'm trying to say is illegal speech, wrong speech, hate speech, and my opponent is, okay speech, fine speech, love speech, whatever you want to call it, and mine is illegal and theirs is legal, well, that makes the whole idea of a ballot or a running for election and trying to impart your ideas to people for their vote moot. It makes that whole process moot, obviously. So there is no democracy without free speech, however you feel about democracy. This guy just it's whatever. This is an author, Alexander Michael John. He says, for a democracy to work, an informed electorate is necessary. In order to be appropriately knowledgeable, there must be no constraint on the free flow of information and ideas. Democracy will not be true to its essential ideal if those in power are able to manipulate the electorate by withholding information and stifling criticism. Right, so that's basically that. Now, this other guy makes a point which I found particularly interesting. Thomas Emerson argues that freedom of speech helps to provide a balance between stability and change. And that's a big thing for me here, is that, this hate speech law the government want to bring in, the Irish government, Fine Gael government, is not about, they're not saying, we want to stifle the entire franchise of free speech. They're really talking about a specific thing. People who want to speak up against replacement migration, critique multiculturalism, people who want to inform the population that Irish people will become a minority in the next number of decades, right? It's very specific. That's what they want to stifle here. They don't just want to stifle the marketplace of ideas, carte blanche. It's, among other things, it's mainly about this. And, there's the evidence for that is like crystal clear, obviously. But just this point spoke to me because it's important in society to balance the whole idea of stability and change, because you have the conservative and, let's say, the progressive, and these various forces always at play of change and stability and, conservatism, you could say. And, both of these can be valid depending on which instance you're talking about. But the thing that allows you to course correct and kind of safety valve on these is free speech. That if something is, going too slow or it's outmoded or outdated, the stability aspect, you have the free expression to critique that and say, we need to change this. It's not good. Times have changed. We need to move on and develop, right? The world, technology, everything changes. So you can speak on that. But if something is going 200 kilometers an hour into a brick wall in terms of change, and you need to criticize that, and the government are on board with it, media are on board with it, NGOs are on board with it, corporations are on board with it, and like I said, the media are on board with the freedom, the press themselves. You're like, what are you going to do about that when all the institutions are bought in? Well, the thing that gives you relief, and you go, well, it'll course correct, because at least there'll be one guy, 10 guys, 10 girls, whatever, who can speak up. And if what they're saying is true enough, then it will have an outsized impact, and it will hopefully trickle up the ladder and kind of rein in that change to the extent that it needs to be reined in. And that's what the value of free speech, obviously, is this aspect of it's standard stuff, the marketplace of ideas and all that. But this is where it really matters, in my opinion, which is why I took this quote, because I think it's very insightful. He says, freedom of speech acts as a safety valve, like I said, to let off steam when people might otherwise be bent on revolution. So again, it takes the wind out of the sails of having to have a kind of a tempestuous change, and potentially, and I'm not advocating for anything like this, but just throughout history, we see that, when people don't have a voice, things get, partisanship grows and grows and grows and grows, and it boils over, and that happens, right? But if you have free speech, then you can just course correct and find a consensus once all the arguments are out there. And that's why I advocate for free speech, is because it's a peaceful method of reining in different ideas and coming to a consensus and agreement on those. I'm starting to harp on a little bit now. He argues that the, quote, principle of open discussion is a method of achieving a more adaptable and at the same time more stable community, of maintaining the precarious balance between healthy cleavage and necessary consensus. He furthermore maintains that opposition serves a vital function in offsetting or ameliorating normal process of bureaucratic decay. So again, free speech, that lone person with a voice who can speak, who can write, who can talk, who can advocate, can speak up against this decay, whether you're talking about bureaucratically or civilizationally. There will be enough people out there who see the wood from the trees in a certain sense. And whether you're talking about migration or whatever your issue might be, you want to know that free speech is available to people, that even if you're not or institutionally kind of, souped up in a sense with all this money and power, at least the one guy, if it's true enough, if it's right enough, if it's correct enough, if people agree with them enough, then that can go a long way. And it stops that bureaucratic decay. So to speak to the actual reality here, again, in Ireland, you have media, NGOs, government, all of this, all on board, corporations, tech monopolies, everything, right? And I don't mind that. I don't want parity on that. I don't say, give me the power of tech companies and of media and all that to make it a fair fight. I'm like, no. I will settle. I'll be generous, and I'll settle for just allow me to say what I want to say in whatever humble means I have. But just if you don't allow that, then you're really in a dark place there, and you're going to, society is going to react to that. There's going to be a problem emerge. You cannot just suppress something like that and expect it not to just manifest itself in other ways. I don't want to talk too much about that. So who else have we got here? Richard Moon has developed the argument that the value of free speech and freedom of expression lies with social interactions. Yes, this also is that, outside of politics and, the struggle for the power in the state and all of that, speech allows communities to speak to each other and to, and people to interact. It's a social thing. People with various types of political beliefs need to communicate to each other. That's the other value, obviously, of expression, is communicating to each other. So, to take an extreme example, you look at North Korea. Someone might have a problem with the state and say, I don't have as much food as I had last year. What's happening here? The other guy down the road might think the same thing, but they don't know. Each person doesn't know that everybody else is thinking it. It's kind of like the emperor has no clothes type of stuff. And that's, you see it in a less maybe extreme way. You see it even in Ireland, but particularly on these PC issues or whatever, migration, gender, this and that. People are kind of, sometimes people will be reluctant to speak up, and you have to give them permission to, and then they kind of do, but they're looking over their shoulder, they're worried. I just think that's an unhealthy and ugly society. I don't want to live in that. So just purely at an aesthetic and at a social or cultural level, I want free speech for communities. And, it's my tired old point at this stage, but the asylum industry and my video on that, and a big theme I noticed in my experience with that stuff is that people are kind of put away and sequestered away from each other mentally, and they can't join together as a community and stand up together as a community. So they end up divided and maybe even pitted against each other, even though they agree, just because they're afraid of what's coming down on top. Now, that's one thing, but to make that, to go from that state, which is bad enough, into now it's not just de facto illegal, it's literally illegal, is not cool. So, I mean, what else have I got on this now? So, this is an impromptu video, so, give me a break on this, because I didn't exactly, prepare or get it all together very well. By entering into a discussion with others, an individual participates in the development of knowledge, and in the direction of their community. So again, that ability to decide what's our community going to do? What do we want? It's this hate speech stuff, whether it's the de facto stuff, or particularly with this now where they want to make it literally illegal, it penetrates that, and it says, it puts the individual in a position where they cannot participate in the development of knowledge, and crucially in the direction of their own community. Here's just one final point on this, and I won't be too long more here, is just an interesting point here from this author, researcher Judith Lichtenberg. She argues that freedom of the press does not necessarily enable freedom of speech. So her point here is that freedom of the press may actually constrain freedom of speech. For example, where the media suppresses information and stifles the diversity of voices inherent in freedom of speech. Lichtenberg argues that freedom of the press is simply a form of property right, summed up by the principle, quote, no money, no voice, unquote. And that's a bit wordy or whatever, but again, I'm not pitting these values or rights or whatever, these kind of Enlightenment rights, against each other. Freedom of the press, freedom of speech, they're not quite the same thing, because again, the press can be institutional and can be suppressive of the voices of the people. And we see this in Ireland. The reason this speaks to me, because ordinarily this might just be a bit of wordy academia, it speaks to me very strongly because I recognise that in Ireland, the press is somewhat free, largely corporatized and everything, but in theory it's free from the state. But what do? They promote the state ideology for the most part. Like you had the media awards last night in Ireland where they all gave each other awards, and you have the journalist of the year goes to the guy who exposed a footballing association of Ireland. The guy in charge of that was kind of embezzling some money, a few $100,000, and the usual kind of cronyism. And he did good journalism to expose that, but I'm kind of going, that's just a little bit of, standard Gambine corruption. It's not like that was counter to the state or the core regime in any particular way. That was just a bit of kind of third world level Gambine corruption that he called out. Fair play, but I didn't see any of this journalism, any of these journalists being kind of radically anti-regime in any particular way, or exposing the regime in any particular way. And that's the press. And that it's bad enough that that's the case, that they don't expose the regime, but to me, maybe this is just from where I'm sitting, but they seem to devote way more energy into suppressing independent voices. They might think I'm a bad guy or someone else is a bad guy, but look, I don't have a corporation funding me or any of that stuff. I'm just speaking into a microphone, as are lots of other people. And they seem to spend way more time trying to undermine and discredit people like that than they do, discrediting massive institutions, corporations, tech companies, all of this stuff. So the press, while it's related to free speech, this is not what we're talking about here. The government are not trying to clamp down on what the Irish Times want to say. This law could come in tomorrow, and the Irish Times could say what they've been saying for years, and nothing changes. What does that tell you? This is about organic speech from the masses, from normal people, from people, to kind of make up a word, uninstitutional people, shall we say. Now that's the free speech lark, just the kind of boilerplate stuff. I'm just going to have a little little sip there. Now I just want to talk about a few things more generally and wrap up. And it's just written down here, whatever. Free speech theory versus what it's actually about. Yeah, so, the protest tomorrow is free speech. That's great. Brilliant. John Milton and all this kind of stuff, and Enlightenment, free speech, the marketplace of ideas. That's great. I don't disagree with that. Two things can be true at the same time. But in my opinion, what this is really about, like I've said already, is not just about the government aren't coming out tomorrow and saying, or coming out with this law and saying, we disagree with Milton and free speech and Voltaire and all of this. We don't want free expression. They're not saying that. They're saying hate speech. It's their euphemism. It's the dog whistle. But they're saying we don't want anti-multiculturalism, anti-replacement migration, anti-becoming a minority speech. That's what we don't want talked about, right? So in a sense, it's weird to constantly protest or push back on laws like this just on the basis of free speech. And again, I'm not criticizing that, but I am criticizing it, but in a healthy, constructive way, right? And it's just my opinion. That's not what it's about here. They're trying to make it illegal to say that Irish people will become a minority in the next number of decades. Multiculturalism has problems, has negative effects on social cohesion, all of these various normal, demonstrable, fact-based criticisms. And they want to make that illegal. They'll try to tell you that it's about shouting a racial slur at some innocent guy who's just somewhere, right? That's not really what this is about. I think to some extent that's already illegal. And it's not the problem. It's not a big issue. Clearly, it's not what they're talking about. Charlie Flanagan, the Minister of Justice, one of the guys spearheading this, openly said on a radio show, which I will link once I find it, talking about Niall, the Irish Patriot YouTuber, asking him about migration at the ploughing championships. You'll take a look at that video if you haven't seen it. I'm sure most of you have. He said it's that kind of stuff, and that was literally Niall was asking him a question. He said, a lot of Irish people are concerned about mass immigration, Charlie. What do you have to say about it? That's all he said. I mean, talk about giving yourself away. And Charlie Flanagan said on the radio that this is the kind of stuff we're talking about. He cited that as his example of hate speech and the kind of stuff that's being said. So that's what they're talking about. So I appreciate standing up for free speech. I do it myself. I genuinely, from the heart, do value it as a concept. But this isn't necessarily about that. I wouldn't go around to someone and say, once they ban that, they'll be coming for you next, and you won't be able to share recipes with each other because you won't be able to exchange ideas. It's like, no, they will stop after that. It won't be an endless, first they came for me and then they came for you. They're coming specifically for this, and that's why they're doing this. So my personal take is to stand up against this on that basis, confront it as it is, as opposed to trying to maybe hide behind this kind of conceptual thing a bit too much, which is fine. People can do that. But I personally, that's been going on for decades in America, in Britain, this kind of hiding behind the skirt of free speech is all I'm talking about. There's no actual basis or material in what we're talking about here. It's just conceptual. It's just philosophical. I mean, I'm not personally into that so much. Now, the other thing I want to mention is just something I heard, and I talked about this on Niall's stream actually, to mention him again, but I just want to emphasize it, is that someone I like said, or I've heard it, it's not just one person, I've heard this a couple of times, which is we need to be careful not to give them any more excuse to bring in these hate speech laws, because we have to be careful not to give them a cause or a reason for it. And that's, to me, that's completely defeatist, because when this law comes in, I will not recognize that law. I don't think I speak any hate, but if someone says I do, and it is under that law and they want to arrest me for that, then go ahead, right? I will not be censored on normal topics, right? That most people in Ireland actually agree with. Just look at Laura Towler's We Were Never Asked documentary in Britain. She demonstrated that most people do not want to become a minority in Britain, right? The same, I can guarantee you, would be true here. So for saying things that 50% or more, probably much more of the population would agree with in private, to be arrested or to be prosecuted or fined for that, I will not. I'm not going with that, right? But nor will I go with that before it's implemented. So I feel like trying to victim blame and say, well, we don't want to give them an excuse, so let's not say this or that or the other to prevent them from having a cause to introduce this law. You've already decided to abide by that law in your mind before it's been implemented. So no, it's not being brought in because someone said this or someone said that. They've been talking about it for years. Like I say, they want to bring us up to international norms and all of this. This is coming from outside of Ireland. It's coming from on high. It's not like they just reacted to something that was said. They might be using it, yes, as an excuse, but if they don't use that as an excuse, they will use something else. So we needn't alter our discourse, or anybody, even if whatever your point of view might be, do not alter your discourse to avoid or hide from this law. I just don't agree with that at all. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is Lee Kuan Yew. So I'm a big fan of his. I've read his memoirs and all of that stuff. He's a state leader, not perfect, a little bit of a neocon, kind of, or neolib type of guy, but a brilliant state leader, and I admire him a lot. Very, very intelligent guy. Now, I actually tried to upload videos to this platform here. I couldn't get them to work, so I will just link them in the bottom. But he has a speech where he went to New York to speak to the press. It was in Washington, actually, because he was criticized for censoring the media, for kind of putting his finger on the scales with the media a little bit, state regulation of the media, foreign media. He was criticized as a banana republic, tin pot dictator type of thing by the American press. So he went to Washington to address them, and far from an Idi Amin or a Mugabe type, crackpot, extremely intelligent, thoughtful guy, he stood up there and he said, listen, Singapore was founded a few decades ago. We have Tamil, we have Malay, we have Chinese majority, and we have English, speaking English, basically white European minority as well. And he just spoke about all of these different examples where there would be riots and this and that, and how he was trying to form a state and it would be impossible. And he defended the idea that he had to censor that country or to regulate the media. He didn't do it in any extreme way, but he did it to some extent. And he, in his speech, he basically had left his critics speechless, because he demonstrated how he understood free speech. He said, I understand. He said, I'm not just some thick, person. I understand the theory of free speech, the marketplace of ideas. I get it, but it's just not. And he says it's a good thing in theory. It's great. Works in America, works in some places, fine. Or, well, I don't know if it works in America, but he said in theory it's good. But then he went on to talk about how Singapore was an extremely multiracial, multi-religious, multicultural society. It was a newly formed society, and that it simply would not work. It would fall apart at the seams and collapse into conflict unless they got some consensus in the media and kind of controlled it at its fringe, and then just formed a kind of a one media consensus in the state. And you know what? Singapore was a great success. It's one of the success models for multiculturalism in the world. But what it does demonstrate is that multiculturalism, multi-religionism, shall we say, and all of that stuff, many ethnicities and all of these different communities living together in a kind of a equal share, cannot facilitate free speech. It just can't. There's too much. It's tribalism. It's human nature to take things very seriously. People will take their ethnic, goals and their point of view, which might not, and religious, might not always get along with the others. They will take that far more seriously than they will take a tax policy or this or that. They will get very serious about that. And sometimes, as we see in the north of Ireland and have seen for hundreds of years and still do, it's yet to be seen where that'll go. These things can be insoluble. Nationalism, as what's his name? The guy who wrote I've forgotten his name, the author. I think it might be Mearsheimer. Anyway, Someone once said that nationalism is the strongest force on earth. And what is nationalism? It's not a state. It's your people. It's your religion, your ethnicity, your ancestry, shared ancestry, and all of that stuff. Just look up the definition of nation. It's the strongest force on earth. It can't be controlled by just kind of technocracy. It's going to rear its head. I don't think nationalism's bad, but it's not going to be suppressed. And just like Lee Kuan Yew, I think what the Irish government are doing with this is looking at it and saying, we're 20% minority now, and in a few decades we'll be basically half minority. And a society like that can't happen when you have free speech. It's just not possible. You will have native people here, Irish people, who will naturally criticize this change and the speed at which it's happening. And that will, in certain cases, be a bit radical and offend other groups and all of this stuff, which they call racism. It might not be racism. It's just this idea of competing interests. So you will have people from all groups express their interests, and they know that it's not possible to push this all the way ahead when you have a certain number of Irish people who will speak up and they will draw attention. And a lot of people in Ireland, people who don't speak up themselves, will be attracted to that and will say, that's my voice, that's what I want to hear, I agree with that and everything. So they just know that that's not possible. That will, while they're presiding over this change and designing this kind of society for us in the decades ahead, they know that that cannot involve free speech. They have to rein that in, and they have to call this criticism that comes from people like me, many other people, or just anybody. They have to call that criticism out, and if it's going to be illegal, they have to call it something. Let's call it hate speech. Let's call it bad speech. Let's call it wrong speech. Whatever we call it, we have to make that illegal. Doesn't mean everybody will get arrested, but some person will. Some person at the tip of the spear, at the fringe, will get it, and it'll have that chilling effect back. And all of this, we see it in England, we see it in Germany, all of these places. So that's what it's really about. They're not cracking down on just free speech. They're cracking down on criticism of this replacement migration that's going on in Ireland, right? Simple as. And that's what it is in all of these countries, right? That's what it is. So I'm just outlining the difference between free speech as a theory and what we're actually being censored on. It needs to be made clear to people. They're not just blocking free speech, they're doing a very specific thing, and explain that to people. They're saying they want it to be effectively illegal to say that we will become a minority in a few decades, right? I've rambled on that for way too long, sorry. But what else have I got here? Just little notes for myself here. Someone made this point to me recently, and I don't know how true it is, but it's worth mentioning anyway. It could be true. It's definitely interesting, is that this will disproportionately affect the working class or whatever, people who aren't as savvy with media, people who aren't, seasoned in kind of activism, journalism, rhetoric, politicians, that kind of stuff, who might be from the populist, nationalist right, who would have that kind of savvy. It probably, I can see this being true, is that it would be more some person, let's call it the Tala local community anti-vandalism group or whatever, which sometimes these things are a reaction to certain ethnic gangs in their community and these kind of things, which are real. They do exist. Communities will have these groups that are kind of somewhat dog whistle to these things. Extremely grassroots, not ideological, not propagandistic. But one of these groups, they might have a meeting sometime and one of the leaders might say stuff that it's not necessarily extreme, but it's just worded in such a way that it can be taken in its worst interpretation, and that person gets jailed. A perfect example of this, just to cut to the chase and make it easier to understand here, is one that struck me anyway when this guy made this point to me, was Billy Charlton in the UK. Now you can look up that guy. He said things about the Muslim grooming gangs in England and various things like this, some kind of provocative points to a crowd. He was a community guy, not normal guy, but he was speaking vigorously to a crowd, and he would go around England speaking to people, and he's in jail now, as far as I know, for hate speech. And I learned about Billy Charlton watching a Morgoth video. Morgoth is an English YouTuber. I learned about it through Morgoth. Morgoth was just kind of paying homage to this guy and just kind of talking about it and sharing his ideas on this event of Billy Charlton being locked up. And I just thought of that because Morgoth, I'm a big fan of him, and I think he's great, but his ideas are far more radical as far as I can see, than Billy Charlton's. Far more out there, pushing the line. But Morgoth knows what he's saying. He knows how to phrase and parse what he's saying, and it's unlikely that Morgoth will ever be caught up in such a kind of a hate speech thing in the way that Billy Charlton was. It's unlikely that I'll be caught up in such a thing, because as things change, I'll be able to read and I'm not calling myself super smart or anything, I just pay attention to these things. I'll be able to read the changes and kind of parse things in the right way, so as to avoid the kind of Eye of Sauron, so to speak. And some other people might not. So I see that as being a problem. So in one sense, it either affects the YouTubers, the journalists, the politicians, and that's bad because you're kind of, a person who uses their voice for other people is being targeted, or those people don't get targeted and it's grassroots, ordinary kind of people who don't focus on political and media rhetoric too much. Either way, it's kind of bad, but it's just worth thinking about who could get caught up in this net. Another thing I just wanted to mention is that we've had racial minorities here for decades, right? Phil in it, Paul McGraw, the stuff we always hear about. For decades and decades, right? In much smaller numbers, obviously. Now, we didn't need those laws then. People could argue that we did, but realistically we didn't, right? There was no major need for them then, life went on. And I'm just reminded of, I was abroad recently and I was going into a bar and there was a doorman there, and he was a black guy. And he asked me where I'm from. I said, I'm from Ireland. And he said, where are you from? And I said, when people ask you that question, you're thinking, are you really going to know, or are you just being polite? I said, I'm from Cork, this down south. And he was like, oh, I know Cork. He was like, I was in Cork in the 80s. I was playing basketball and some other stuff. And he started telling me about Neptune and Ballincollig, and he started putting on a Cork accent and all of this. And we had a good chat. And it was just funny because he's putting on the Cork accent, giving it the banter and all of this stuff. And he was there in the 80s. And I didn't ask him, did you receive hate? Did you have to live with racism and hate every day and all of this stuff? I didn't ask him that, so he didn't answer that. But, it's quite obvious talking to him that he spoke about it with absolute fondness. And it's quite obvious that this guy, like sociable guy, didn't, get any kind of hatred or anything. So again, it's not about, they'll bring you in to support a law like this by saying, you don't want a black person to be abused on the street, cornered on the street, do you? And on that basis, you'd be inclined to say, oh, well, yeah, I suppose maybe you're right. But that's not what it's about, because that hasn't really been the case. They're talking about social engineering for replacement migration, and that's all it is. So it's a bait and switch. They're bringing you in on one thing that you could agree on, but it's really something else entirely. And this guy demonstrated that to me. He was in Cork in the 80s. He had a great time. No big problem. I'm sure he was very popular with people, nice guy and everything. Probably people were even interested in him, right? Because he's something, oh, where are you from? This and that, right? I just have Phil in it written down here. I suppose it's kind of the same thing. Thin Lizzy weren't just like a hit band abroad. They were a hit band in Ireland, right? They were cherished in Ireland. Phil in it being half black, I think. Frontman of that band. Thin Lizzy were mega popular in Ireland. Now, if everybody in Ireland, and this is the 60s, 70s, if everybody in Ireland was racist, why would they be jamming out to his music and enjoying it and posters and all of this stuff? Because they don't hate, they haven't. And so this problem hasn't existed before. Which leads me to a point by Patrice O'Neill. He's an black American comedian. Really funny. He's dead now, died a few years ago. Another sip of wine. I'm thirsty and I'm drinking wine. I don't know, is it a good idea? But Patrice O'Neill was this very, very funny comedian. No filter, completely anti-PC and all that stuff. But there's just a clip of him talking about Ireland. And he talks about how he used to come to Ireland back in the day for some comedy things, and everybody there was so nice. And, Ireland being the kind of blacks of Europe and all this kind of stuff, that there was this kind of like shared, and I'll be accused of generalizing and stuff, but, black Americans kind of have this boisterous personality and this outgoing, extroverted personality, and Irish people have an element of that too. And, people were just like, hey, it's interesting to meet this person, American guy, whatever. And he said that it was the friendliest experience in the world. And then he came back like a decade later for some more comedy shows and stuff. And he said that people had gotten less, friendly. They weren't hating on him or anything like that, but they were just, whatever, because his point was that Nigerians, and he said this, not me. He said that we had taken in lots of Nigerians because of our economy and all this stuff. And people just saw him as just another Nigerian immigrant, and maybe the bit of friction, between different groups. People are a bit jaded of this immigration and didn't quite fancy it so much. So they just saw him now as just like a Nigerian immigrant or whatever, and they weren't too hot on him in that sense. And he makes that point, and it's like, okay, so we weren't racist then, but as you bring more and more and more and more minorities without asking anybody, people will, and I'm reluctant to use the word racist, but in a certain sense, people will become a bit more racist, right? Because of something being forced on them in that sense. So that's another reason why this hate speech thing is necessary from their point of view. But the key point is that you could bring in this hate speech law to try and paper over the cracks and suppress opposition, or you could just see the need to introduce this hate speech law, as you see it, as a warning sign and a reason to pull back on mass immigration, to basically moratorium it. Because you go, if we're at the point where we need to introduce laws to suppress our own people to push this through even further, I mean, we could do that, or we could just stop it. We could just stop doing that. And Patrice O'Neill, if he were alive, I think, given the point he made, he's just kind of joking when he made this point, but it's very true. He would agree with me on that, actually. And I think a lot of people of color would agree with me on that. So that's that point. It's that, they're ignoring the option of pulling back on mass immigration here, which would, make the need to introduce this, if there is such a need, completely moot. But no, they're just choosing to suppress. I just have written here, rule by NGO. I mean, it's effectively ruled by NGO. So if you, come on, which one of us wants to live in a society where they're the ones dictating what is and isn't hate, which is now deemed as illegal, and they can now decide and change and mold what isn't hate? NGOs, government funded, EU funded, corporation funded NGOs, dictating your mind or your speech, what you can say, your communication, your interactions and relations with others, and your discourse, your point of view. I don't want to live in NGOcracy. What else have I got here? Oh yeah, just interesting, because when Google and all of these companies start to ban people offline, collectively, it happened to Gemma O'Doherty. I'm sure it'll happen to plenty more. Some of these kind of lefties, whatever you want to call them, radlibs, shall we say, would go, oh, but they're a private company, which is completely transparently hollow. They don't really believe that. But they kind of go, no, well, I do believe in free speech, but this isn't a violation of your free speech. It's just a private company deciding who they do interact with, do business with. Now, I'll be waiting for these apologists and these people to speak up, maybe even attend tomorrow and say, okay, well, we used our smarmy little point about private companies before, but now this is the state. Okay, this one we actually are against, based on their own alleged values that they had about private versus state. This is state censorship. Just because you call it hate doesn't mean it isn't censorship. Oh, well, I'm against censorship and I support free speech, but that's I don't like that, though. I mean, I'm kind of being a basic bitch here saying that, but these people are completely called on their bluff here when they not only will abstain from defending the right to speak your mind on immigration, but they will be enthusiastic supporters of the state in this. Just the point of people talking about free speech being in our constitution. Look, I don't know, it'd be great if Ireland had a US-style First Amendment. I don't think we do. I'm not a legal expert on this. But, I mean, the free speech law we have in this country it has caveats for offending the public morality and all of this kind of stuff. It's not a straight up and down free speech law like the American one is. I could pretend it is, but it's not. So to me, they're attacking the right to criticize multiculturalism, replacement migration. And that's all it is about. I don't care what's written on a piece of paper or what John Milton once said or blah-de-blah or a constitution even. we don't particularly have we don't have an ironclad free speech clause in this country. I would support introducing one, but I don't think we do. So I don't personally want to rely on a 100-year-old constitution that doesn't even protect me on this anyway. I want to live in the now and support it based on the situation as it is here and make the arguments from first principle. So, but I think that's about it, to be honest. I may as well cut my losses here and say goodbye. But just to repeat, tomorrow, the 16th of November, Saturday, at 2 p.m., try to make it along. Just an opportunity to get out and interact with some other people. You know, not everybody is radical right and all of this kind of stuff. Lots of normal people there. It should be a bit of fun and an opportunity to have a chat with some other people and discuss ideas. So do try to come along, and thanks for watching. See you.